Over the years, I can say that I've grown to become familiar with the greatest works of Shakespeare. Though most of my vast knowledge hasn't come from the simple dry reading of books. No. Books. Pfft. Where then, you might ask, have I acquired my great learning? From plays, perhaps? Studying live performances? Better yet, the cinema. Well, DVDs. Actually, mostly YouTube. Back in 2010, each day for a week or two, I looked forward to the 10 minutes a day during my lunch break when I would sit down to enjoy one of Shakespeare's finest works. At the end of each 10-minute YouTube video, I would ask myself the question, to watch or not to watch some more. But with self-discipline, I managed to stretch it out for as long as I could. The play, of course, was Hamlet, and in the version I am familiar with, the protagonist was portrayed by none other than the wondrous Shakespearean thespian, Mel Gibson. For me personally, I think Shakespeare is all about the one-liners. To be or not to be, get thee to a nunnery, and the lady doth protest too much, methinks. The last line I quoted, the lady doth protest too much, methinks, was like Inception before Inception. It was about a play within a play, and Hamlet, in staging this play, cleverly sets up his mother, Queen Gertrude, exposing her own insincere and heartless attitude to her own murdered husband, and she comes out with the clangor, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. To which Hamlet famously replies with the equally brilliant one-liner, takes one to know one, I think, though it could also have been hasta la vista, baby. Anyway, the much more general idea behind the Queen's statement is that too much protesting and shouting about your own innocence only makes you look more guilty. And don't we all know it? If someone tries too hard to impress, or shouts too loudly their opinion, or protests too much about the truth, what do people say? They say he's compensating for something, or he's afraid of something, or he must be hiding something. People aren't fools. As Jesus says, when it comes to speaking the truth, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. When we try too hard to convince other people, whether it's with over-the-top words or actions, more often than not it will only achieve the opposite of what we want anyway. We'll become less believable and more suspicious. So when we read our section of Acts for today, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was a plan of out-and-out deception, but we shouldn't be surprised that their dramatics arouse suspicion. They protest too much. Let's listen to David Suchet as he reads from Acts chapter 21, verses 15 to 26.
After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Mnason, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses, so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we've written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them.
When Paul and his companions finally make it to Jerusalem, I'm sure there was both a sense of relief as well as some level of concern. From last time we know that Paul and his companions did not expect good things to come their way in Jerusalem. Initially things seem positive. Verse 17, Luke writes that the brothers and sisters received us warmly. After all, why not? There's good reason to set the date of Paul's letter to the Romans during the 3-month stay in Greece, probably Corinth, which Luke records in chapter 20, verse 3-4. And if that is the case, which I believe it is, Paul and his companions, including representatives from the various Gentile, aka non-Jewish churches from Turkey, Greece, general area, they didn't come empty-handed. Paul writes in Romans chapter 15, verses 25-26. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. There was good reason for Jerusalem to receive them warmly. Paul and the companions were bringing charity money from the generous non-Jewish new believers in order to provide for the more needy Jewish believers who were poor and struggling back in Jerusalem. A few years previously, Jerusalem had struggled from the great famine during the reign of Emperor Claudius. So perhaps there were lingering effects of poverty from that, but it's also the case that the Jewish believers were generally more persecuted than their non-Jewish believing brothers. Jews who believed were kicked out of the synagogue, which effectively means they were excommunicated. And unless they happened to be fairly well off or somehow more financially independent, they were really suffering for their association to Jesus and his rather radical gospel message. It's probably also the case that Paul preached to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the same message that he wrote in Romans chapter 1 verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Paul would have explained the importance of Gentiles, non-Jews, being involved in supporting the mission of the Jewish church in Jerusalem, to reach out to their Jewish countrymen and see them come to accept and follow Jesus too. So yes, Paul and his companions brought with them some funds to help the poor in Jerusalem, but there was also at least some understanding by everyone that this Gentile generosity would do more than fill stomachs. It would help support the Jerusalem church in leading people to Jesus. I'm not talking bribery, or what's called rice Christians, or taking the soup, which really amounts to forcing people to convert because they've no other choice but starvation. But let's face it, even if there is absolutely no strings attached to an act of kindness, then unless the person on the receiving end is some kind of heartless leech, they will attach strings. If nothing else, they might pass on some act of kindness to someone else, like paying for the next coffee or McDonald's for the person behind you, or letting someone out at the next road end. And the reality is that without any desire to be coercive or manipulative, that showing Christ's love and kindness to people, it does attract people to Christ. And Jesus encourages that, saying in the Sermon on the Mount, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So there is no deception involved. But for any suspicious Jew, I'm sure he would have quoted something similar to the common expression, "There is no such thing as a free lunch." If Gentiles are sending money to Jerusalem, what exactly are they expecting in return? Here comes Paul, the Paul who preaches against the laws of Moses, so they say, with foreign Gentile friends and foreign Gentile money, which more than likely has Nero's face on it, too. That didn't help. And what does he think he's going to buy with it? Surely he intends to convert Jews into Gentiles. So hopefully you can begin to feel the tension. Which is why Luke only very briefly gives one verse to Paul here. Verse 19. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Yeah, sure. Next line, they praised God. But then, very quickly down to the real issue, which takes up the rest of this section. Much more important than anything the Apostle Paul had to report about the success of the mission and all the non-Jewish converts and their generosity in supplying financial support to the poor in Jerusalem is the issue of how things would appear to the Jewish church in Jerusalem. There might even have been a hint of accusation as they remind Paul of their decision back in chapter 15 about what was expected of Gentile Christians. As for Gentile believers, we have written to them about our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. As if to say, by the way, I hope you haven't forgotten Paul. But, more crucial even than what the Gentiles are being taught, are these unfortunate rumours about what Paul was teaching Jews. That he was denying the traditions and laws of Moses. The concern wasn't so much that he was failing to convert Gentiles into Jews. That had been discussed previously. But now, in effect, he was converting Jews into Gentiles. Or so it looked anyway. And I'm fairly sure that the suspicion wasn't just outside the room. From the last similar meeting in chapter 15, we know that some of the elders or leaders were from the party of the Pharisees. And they were of the opinion that all Gentiles, aka non-Jews, who become believers also had to convert to become Jews. They weren't happy with Paul's relaxed attitude to Jewish customs. They possibly had even read his letters, like his letter to the Galatians, where he writes, "Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation." But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume they tried their best to quench these rumours as a leadership, and that they themselves weren't making any accusations against Paul. In an attempt to please everyone, they hatch a plan, a little charade, a drama, all in an effort to make Paul look more kosher. And it wasn't subtle. In verse 23 to 24, they ask Paul to join 4 men taking a Nazirite vow. He wasn't taking the vow himself, he only had to go through a lesser ritual purification to come along. Paul's part was to be basically the public sponsor for the ceremony. It was all for show, just an act, or a drama, in an over-the-top effort to convince the public that Paul was totally kosher. And of course no one is fooled. And the plan backfires spectacularly, which we will read about next week. I believe Paul went along with it not because he thought it was a good idea. It was his intention coming to Jerusalem to continue to build relationships between the churches, prayer, finances, missional cooperation. And so if this dumb plan is what the Jerusalem church believed was best, then perhaps this might help build bridges with them, even if it was attracting unwanted attention to himself. While we might have admiration for Paul, for his willingness to cooperate and compromise on issues that were really non-essential for the sake of the gospel and gospel partnership, it's hard to have any admiration for the Jerusalem leadership here, who expected the apostle to jump through hoops and put on a big drama and performance simply so that no one would be offended. I suppose it's the cancel culture of the first century, really. The world hasn't changed much, has it? Get kosher or get cancelled. Whatever popular culture or society determines kosher to be. For some so-called Christians, it's all about fitting into church culture. Perhaps it means having the right clothes, or the right demeanour, or making all the right noises while basking in the light of the stained glass windows. Normally, how that looks from outside the church is a smug sense of self-righteous superiority. Unbelievers, well, they're a bit like the first century Gentiles, unclean. Perhaps such so-called Christians even fool themselves into thinking that they're just portraying the best side of Christianity. Christians are different. Christians are holy, which is true, but not if it's all just an act. And it won't be long before people see through it, which will only reinforce the belief that Christians are actors, they're deceivers, and they're hypocrites. For other so-called Christians, they claim to follow Christ, but they're more concerned about what the world thinks is kosher, the new moral non-binary absolutes of 2020, whatever it means to be accepted by society. That's how the church needs to portray itself, to be loved by the world, give the world what it wants, and eventually they will love us and love Jesus. Above all else, accommodate. And in the end, it becomes less about drawing people to Jesus and more about the desire to be loved and accepted ourselves. As a famous preacher once famously said, friends of all and the enemies of none. Though experience and wisdom in life soon teaches us quite the opposite, that a friend to all is a friend to none. Not even on Facebook can you get likes from everyone all the time. When Jesus called us to love our enemies, I think the basic assumption has to be that we would have enemies to love. You can't love your enemies if you don't have any. And essential to that love is being truthful, without all the amateur dramatics. Truth and love are not two separate things. We must love people and be truthful, both in our words and actions. And most of all, if we love people, we will tell them the truth of the gospel. And at the heart of that message, well, it can hurt. Growing up, we had a poster on the wall at home. The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. We don't need to lie, or deceive, or hatch ingenious plans, or make ourselves or Jesus or the gospel out to be something that is more palatable or acceptable or tolerable than it really is, because it is the truth. And the really, truly loving thing is to share it. To share the hard-to-palate truth that we're all lost without Jesus, that we're selfish, we're heading for judgment, we need forgiveness, and we need to change. And Jesus is the only hope, Jesus and only Jesus, to surrender to Him, to give our lives to Him, and trust and follow Him as our Saviour and Lord. So if we're tempted, let's ditch the drama and the Shakespearean shenanigans. Let's not pretend to be more holy than we really are. Truth is, there's probably not a day goes past where we think about how we portray ourselves or our best side or whatever it might be so that people will think better of us and perhaps in our own minds better of Christ. But let's not be at it. Let's not be people that we are not, or try to portray Christianity as something that's more acceptable to the culture, twisting the message into something it is not. Let's just, as sinners saved by grace, live out that truth in our words, in our actions, and through doing so, point people to the ultimate truth that is found in Jesus Christ.